I think spying did occur. Yes, I think spying did occur.
Well, let me...
But the question is whether it was adequately predicated. And I'm not suggesting it wasn't adequately predicated, but I need to explore that.
More on that moment. The headline of our next guest's latest op-ed is this: Bill Barr is the most dangerous man in America. In this piece, Rick Wilson tosses aside his customary shackles of journalistic restraint to write, and we quote, William Barr's tone was calm, but his agenda was clear. His job is to protect Donald Trump, no matter the prerogatives of Congress or any consideration of the rule of law. Bill Barr is not the Attorney General of the United States. He is the Roy Cohn whom the Donald has craved, an Attorney General who sees his duty as serving Trump. And we're happy to say that with us tonight, the aforementioned Rick Wilson, a veteran Republican strategist and the author of Everything Trump Touches Dies, recently released with new material in paperback. And there's new material around here every day. Rick, talk some more about Bill Barr and why he might see the president as his client and not the American people.
Well, Brian, thank you for having me. And I will say that the reason I wrote this piece was because, like a lot of other people, I had given Bill Barr the benefit of the doubt. I'd given Bill Barr, based on his reputation in D.C., a moment to decide whether or not he was going to be an honest broker. And when the 4-page memo came out, it was pretty clear. And then when the testimony to Congress this week, in both the House and the Senate, Bill Barr very clearly flagged for the American people, he doesn't work for us. He's not a traditional attorney general who has an independence from the political desires of the White House, because he's the chief law enforcement officer in which has reposed enormous power. And he said basically this week, flat out, I'm here for Donald Trump. I'm here to take care of protecting the president's flank and protecting the president from legal jeopardy. And it should have shocked the conscience of Americans. And frankly, if the Democrats understood power, they would have recognized this moment was a man who was incredibly contemptuous of the rights of Congress to be informed of the things that are in the Mueller report. He's basically rubbing their nose in it right now and saying, you're not getting what you're entitled to. We're not giving it to you. We're protecting Donald Trump. You don't get to see the goods. So it is. I think it's taken a very disturbing turn, and I think Bill Barr is in a position of enormous power, and the president, like he does with everyone, will exploit that power to the maximum advantage. Something I don't think we do often enough is to ask if a judgment like that on Barr isn't a painful exercise for you in this way. Sure. This is a guy who was steeped in the modern history of your party. He was in the Bush wing of the GOP. He was Mr. Republican lawyer. This is his second go-round as Attorney General of the United States, and now this is the assessment that you reluctantly have come to. It really is, Brian. And, I went back because I was a very junior guy in the Bush 41 administration. I was a kid, But I went back and asked people that I knew, and they said, do you know Bill Barr? And everyone, when he was named, said, oh, he's a solid guy, institutional guy. He's not flashy. He's just going to be, he's nuts and bolts, right up the middle. Well, like every other person that gets in Donald Trump's orbit, the moral corruption of Donald Trump is his superpower. And Bill Barr is displaying right now, by using the language of spying and witch hunts and things like that, Bill Barr needed to say, when he was asked about spying, to say, no, it was legally constituted surveillance. He sent a message to the FBI and putting Donald Trump ahead of the people that I supervise in the DOJ. I'm putting people that I supervise ahead of the FBI and the DOJ because I'm going to tell them that Trump's language of their behavior is how we're going to describe it. So I think that this is a guy who is going to meet the everything Trump touches dies test head on in the coming weeks. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.